We hear a lot about the Holocaust. We hear about it in Germany. We hear about Auschwitz. We hear about Dachau. We rarely hear about what went on in Hungary, which is a much smaller country. But equally horrific things happened in Hungary, and some of them happened to the two people in this book. Eva was able to escape in full sight because of her looks. She was light-skinned, she looked more Aryan than Jewish, and she escaped under an assumed name. But she was on the run, literally, and had some really horrible experiences. Her husband, George, was in 3 forced labor camps. And to set that up in your mind about how bad that situation was, the Jewish Virtual Library, a division of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, says that out of 825,000 Jews living in Hungary prior to World War II, approximately 550,000 were murdered, including most of those in forced labor camps. Throughout Europe, the eradication of the Jews happened slowly over time. In Hungary, it took just 54 days. And Eva is about to tell us about her experiences there, and the pictures that you are seeing across the screen are the happier times in their lives, fortunately, and she will tell you about those too. Eva Friedlander.
Thank you. I'm totally touched, overwhelmed, and a little bit scared. I really didn't plan a complete speech, and I'm just going to tell you as it comes to my mind. I rolled over this monologue a million times, you can imagine, and then I decided I'm just going to let it go, and what comes to my mind is what I'm going to share with you. I was very fortunate to get Mickey's collaboration, and going through the experiences that I shared with her was not very easy, I must tell you. Reliving things again is not simple. But I'm so glad that I was able to do that, because I wanted my children and grandchildren and all my friends and acquaintances to know what happened in the little country, which is really not much publicized. A lot has been written about the experiences of people in Poland and Czechoslovakia and other places, but not that much in Hungary. I was born in 1921, so that you know right away how old I am. And the fact that I am here at this party, I call it a party, I feel like a debutante. As a matter of fact, I even have a corsage. One of my little girlfriends gave it to me. My mother always said that I'm a late bloomer. I guess she was right. My childhood years were very happy. I had beautiful, high-class, intelligent parents who doted on me. And when I was 1 year old, my mother and father arranged a huge dinner party in one of the most elegant restaurants, and it was really the party for the grown-ups, not so much for me. But they brought me in a high chair when the dinner was in the middle, and everybody was already a little tipsy, and my father had probably one more glass of champagne, so he stood up and he held the glass in his hand, and he said, "This is a greeting to my daughter, who is the most beautiful little girl in the world, and I predict that she is going to be a snake charmer." He was a little tipsy then. And will hate the porcelain and probably escape with the saxophone player. Well, guess what happened? I didn't hate the porcelain, and the rest didn't happen. The childhood years were beautiful, but there were dark clouds gathering already in Hungary. Slowly, before even the major onslaught by the Nazis, there were more and more restrictions about Jewish professionals who were not allowed to practice their profession. Professors have been canceled at universities. Big business people have been barred to own their business, and they put in people who had to command the show and manage the company. And slowly, slowly they clipped away on everything. Not even speaking of the fact that young people like George, who were ready to enroll in a college, he was going to go in a medical school in Hungary, in Budapest, they were not admitted. And he had to go to Italy, which was a lucky break for him because his father had a lot of business and banking connections with Italy. And he managed to enroll at the University of Bologna at the biochemistry department, and he spent 4 years there and successfully obtained his degree. And the strangest thing is, and I'm saving this huge diploma that he received in 1942 in Bologna, where he is declared doctor in chemistry, and on the back of the diploma, it's written Razza Hebraica, Jewish race. And that was the Mussolini management, which was a devastating blow on everybody. George didn't have to come home to Hungary because the clouds were gathering and things were going already very bad, but he was homesick and he wanted to come home and see his family. And certainly he got involved in having to join the forced labor camps and all the other things that happened after that. But before that happened, in the 30s and early 40s, people had to move together. A family that owned maybe a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment had to accept 3 other families to live with them. They basically created the ghettos, but in small compartments. Many, many other things, of course, and you probably are familiar with the fact that we had to wear a Star of David on our sleeve, visible on the street, which also signified that we could not go to shops and attend our business when other people did. There were restrictions and certain hours when we could do that and we couldn't do it. I was at that time working in a law office as a young girl. I finished a secretarial school because my parents separated. And at 14, I had to attend the secretarial school because my father didn't want me to continue my education. I went into a private high school. And after I finished that, I got a job in a very fine law office. And as much as I was the youngest person in the office, I soon became office manager and enjoyed very much the work and learned a lot. And the 2 partners, the law partners that I worked for, one was a Jewish brilliant attorney and the other one was a non-Jewish guy who was the front, so to say. And my boss, who was the Jewish attorney, wrote the briefs and did all the brain work, and the other one did the court appearances and the trial cases. I've learned a lot there, and I remember that I was sitting on a high chair in front of a big desk with the slant top and the huge book that had the clients' accounting going on. I had to do this by hand every day. Conferences, letters, all the activities. You remember those things. You have seen that in the Dickens books. But that's how I did that. And my writing was better then, not as bad as it's now. But I learned a lot, and it was a lovely social situation for me. I met 2 other lovely young girls, one of them became my very best friend, and the people that we went out and had little dances and get-togethers, and it was a lovely time for me. I learned a lot, and I had fun. Unfortunately, as time went on, the activity of the law office has been curtailed, and I soon had to leave the place because they didn't allow my Jewish boss to do the activity in any fashion. At that time, they have already started recruiting people for various forced labor issues. The men had to be enrolled in a forced labor camp, and the women had been assigned to different places. My first assignment was a huge factory that the Germans established in the outskirts of Budapest, and they manufactured aluminum parts that were necessary in certain places in automobiles. And I had to do a certain part of the work there, which meant that I had to put on some kind of a chemical, and the fumes were so terrible that I couldn't bear it. And fortunately, I was very lucky that they allowed me to sign off and assigned me to another job. And the other job was in a hospital, in one of the major hospitals in Budapest, and I was assigned to the OBGYN department. And Dr. Benedek, who was a famous professor there, was very kind to me, and he taught me a lot, and I really had a very nice time. But none of these things lasted too long, because things were getting so bad. Rumors were going around already that people are taken from the so-called forced labor camps into the major devastating concentration camps, and nothing was secure, only for a short time. And at that point, one of the young attorneys that worked in the law office where I was before called me, and he disclosed to me that he is working for the Zionist underground, and his suggestion for me is not to hang around much longer, because pretty soon I'm going to be picked up and put in a truck and taken to a concentration camp. And he offered to provide some false identity papers for me and my mother, so we can go to another part of the city and try to weather the storm. My mother was first very upset about it, and she hated to leave the apartment that we treasured so much, but I convinced her that we must do this. So on a very short notice, with a little grip in my hand and one in hers, we walked out of the place not to go back anymore. We went to the other side of the city. As you know, Budapest is divided with the big Danube River in the middle. And we moved over to the other side. She was hired by a family as a nanny, being multilingual. And I took a job as a secretary somewhere, because we didn't have money. We had to make a living. We had to pay for rent, for renting a room. She separate and me separate, because our identity papers were not related. In other words, she had a different name, and she wasn't my mother as far as the paperwork is concerned. We have met each other every other day just to make sure that we are all right. I gave her money if I could, or she brought me some cake, or wanted to make sure that I'm all right. And we managed to hold out for quite some time. When the bombardments of the city became closer and more intense, things became imminent, and we knew that the end is probably coming soon. We were jubilating over the bombardments, because each bombardment meant that the Nazis will be pulling back and our liberation is coming closer. We prayed for the air raids, and daily there were air raids in the city, and every time the siren sounded, we had to run to an underground shelter and stay there. And very close to the end of the whole siege, my mother and I met one day, and the siren went off, and she grabbed my hand. She said, "Come, come, come. I know a place where we can hide." And it was a deserted villa in one of the nice residential areas of Buda, which is the residential part of the city. And it seems like she has known the place before. And we ran into this basement, or the cellar rather, and there were a bunch of people already sitting there. They were barely acknowledging us. And we sat down, hoping that it will be over in a little bit, and then we can go on and go again on our separate ways. But unfortunately, it didn't happen, because the Allied forces intensified their attack, hoping to wipe out the remaining resistance. And we stuck there. So we actually spent almost 5 or 6 days, I think, in that basement with no change of clothes, hardly any food. But the people were quite nice, and here and there they had a leftover can of bean or some crackers, and we did what we could. We just had to bide our time, hoping that the end is coming soon. The bombardment stopped, and all of a sudden, the basement door was knocked in, and 3 very severe-looking Russian soldiers came in. They were our liberators. They came in, they started asking people to surrender jewelry, watches, the why watch. We had to take off our jewelry and hand it to them. They looked for perfume, cologne, whiskey, whatever they could find. They even drank the cologne because they thought it's drink. One of the soldiers came around, and I was sitting there because rumors were already going around that as they came in as the liberators, they have been given some liberty to be somewhat abusive, especially with the female population. So my mother insisted that I put a big kerchief on my head and make me look old and sit there with my shoulder pulled up. And these 3 soldiers were busy getting the jewelry and watches away from the people. And this one soldier came over to me, and he saw a little gold necklace that I had on my neck. That was a very sweet gift from my mother, actually from my grandmother. And surprisingly gentle, he reached behind my neck and undid the chain and took it off and walked away with it. And we thought that this is over, that they finished, that they're going to leave. And they were beginning to walk up the steps to go up to the street level, and this one turned around and came back where I was sitting there, stooping over on that little bench where we were hovering around, and he grabbed me by my hand and started pulling me to the door. And my mother and I looked at each other immediately, scared to death because I anticipated what may be coming. And there was nothing I could do. He held me tight. My mother, who was a feisty mother, stood up and ran after me, and she grabbed my other hand. So this one is pulling my hand here, my mother pulling my hand over there. But he was stronger, and he pulled me up, and my mother was screaming, and I forgot what she said in Russian. Go away, this is my daughter, leave her alone. And he laughed, and he said, go. So he kept dragging me. We went about 10 or 15 feet, and my mother was screaming like crazy. And I think maybe he got scared because officially they were not supposed to do this. And he looked at me and he just let me go. So that was a beautiful break for me. One of the many miracles that I experienced during all these horrible times. So we went back to the basement and sat there some more. And the next day, it was a cold, wintry day, we heard a shot and a very strange sound like an animal whining. And they must have shot a horse that was attached to a wagon or something. I'm not sure exactly how it was. And we waited and waited, and one of the men who was in the basement getting shelter with the rest of us said, why don't we go out and see if we can cut a piece of meat, because we haven't had any meat in a week, or any kind of decent food for that matter, except leftover canned beans and crackers. So we went out there with a big butcher knife that he found, and we cut a big piece of meat, which I have never tasted in my life before, but it was wonderful because we cooked it on the sterno cooker that we found in the basement, and everybody had a piece of meat, and we thought that was absolutely a feast. So that was the first experience with horse meat in my life. Pretty soon things quieted down, and the man had a radio which announced that the German troops are in retreat, and we were waiting for a half a day or so to make sure that we don't get in trouble, and we started slowly climbing out of the basement and trying to work our way back to the other side of the city, which was easier said than done because by then all the major bridges have been bombarded. And as we walked, trying to find some kind of a transportation going across the river, there was a, what do you call, not raft, but a barge. And he had already a bunch of people on it, and he was almost ready to leave, and I waved him. I said, please, 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 wait a minute. And so my mother and I jumped on it, and we made our way back to the other side of the city and got away from the place where we were hiding. And then we had to do a huge amount of walking. There was no transportation, no streetcars, no buses, no nothing. The whole place was shut up, bullet holes everywhere, rumbles, gravel, total desperation and total disaster. But we did make our way back home, and surprisingly, our little apartment was reasonably safe. We found a bunch of stuff that was stolen, but we also found the essentials. We had our sofa, we had 2 beds, we had some kitchen equipment, and we thought that we are starting a new life, and we really did. The next question was how to make a living. Here was a city that was totally devastated. No jobs available, no positions, no money. And after a lot of hesitation and conferences with each other, my mother and I decided that we're going to try to do a little business, a little secretarial service. People were very anxious to regain their possessions in the way of apartments or real estate or automobiles. And we opened a little secretarial service that was multilingual. We did translations, German, English. I hired a guy who did the Russian for us. And things started beginning to move for us. We all of a sudden had a little activity and a little money coming in. And on some days we had enough money to eat dinner, and some days we didn't. But it was all right, and we were alive, and the only sad thing about the situation was that my father, who lived away from us with his lady friend, never surfaced, and we didn't know what happened to him. I contacted this woman, and she told me that they both were taken. They waited until it happened, even though I encouraged him and begged him to join us, and I could have provided papers for him to hide along with us, but he was hopeful and in many ways I think rather naive that yes, the Germans will make us work, but we're going to get food and it's going to be okay. Well, it wasn't okay. They picked him and her up together in one of the raids where they entered these apartments and took people down and crammed them in trucks and took them to the trains, and of course you know the rest of the story. I found out that they were taken, and she managed to jump the train and salvaged herself, but my father didn't. And from that point on, I never found out what happened to him. I'm quite sure that he was taken to one of the places, and the only hope I had, and to this day I still have, that I understood that he had poison in a ring that he carried with him, and hopefully he did take it rather than wait for them to do it to him. And we never found out what happened. I have done extensive research with the International Red Cross and the American Red Cross, and nobody knows. So this has never closed in my mind. At the same time, I also found out that my dear little cousin, my mother's brother's youngest son, has been taken. My aunt decided that in order to save her family, the 2 children and herself and her husband, my uncle, she converted and she became a Catholic. And she was hoping that that will help them and keep them from harm's way, but unfortunately that didn't happen. She put my young cousin, who was at that time, I think 11 or 12 years old, in a convent with priests who had several other Jewish children there. And she was hoping that they're going to be able to resist the SS groups or the people that came around to pick up these children, but unfortunately they didn't. And we never saw him anymore, and I'm pretty sure that he ended up in the Mengele camp or some other horrible place. So we had very, very many terrible personal close losses, and our whole life became so volatile. Every day was a new experience, a different danger. How do we get away? What is this day going to bring to us? And I don't even understand to this day how I had the courage to deal with these issues day after day after day. And the only way I can explain it to myself now, that I just did not accept the inevitable. And I kept saying to myself, I can do this, I can overcome. And somehow I did overcome, or somebody was watching over me. I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of guts to overcome difficulties of this magnitude or even lesser. And somehow I've never had a moment doubt that I will overcome. I think that is one of the reasons why I'm standing here and talking to you. After the war, I'm skipping now some years. What?
I want to see if they have any questions.
Wait a minute.
My place.
I didn't tell you when I met George, who's an important part of my story. George walked in my life when I was running this little secretarial service, and he came home from Italy with an assignment as an Italian diplomat to repatriate Italian prisoners of war and Italian vehicles. And pretty soon a romance started. We opened an office for him where he was supposed to conduct his business, and unfortunately that didn't end up very well. He was taken by the secret police and interrogated and eventually released, and you're going to see that in the book. I don't want to give away the whole story. Well, then after that we lived in Italy. Those were very, very happy years and beautiful times. And one day we received our American visa, and that was the most beautiful time. This weekend is celebrating the New Orleans tragedy. And New Orleans was a very important place in my story because George and I arrived to New Orleans in November of 1950. Most immigrants come to New York, but our group that was coming together was directed to New Orleans, and I heard so much about it, but I, of course, didn't have a chance to do any sightseeing at that point, and we were anxious to get on the train and come to Atlanta, which became our home and our residence and our life. And this was a very beautiful experience. We arrived to the station here and got a cab, and I was so used to the big life of a big city in Rome, and Budapest is a huge city. And Atlanta in 1950 was not such a big city, as you remember. And the taxi driver, I gave the taxi driver the instruction where to go. We were directed to this little hotel on Ponce de Leon. Southland Hotel is still existing. And we keep going and going, and I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, when do we get to the city? And he looked at me so angry, you are in the city. But I loved Atlanta, and I still do, and we had such wonderful times here, raised our children, and this is my life, this is my home. I have so many other things that you're going to read in the book. I don't want to give it all away, but if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Thank you. We came in 1950, and Louis was born in 1956. We were already citizens, and then Lynn came 2 years later. Wait a minute, what is this? I'm in Rome here. This is a shooting gallery in Rome where we had fun with our friends. And this is, we are walking in Italy somewhere, I forget where. This is Venice, this is the one that we have on the book cover. And that was my first day when I arrived after George went back to Italy. Can we go back to that for a minute, please? No, okay, all right, all right. And this is my glamour pussy picture. Okay. And that's George. He was a wonderful photographer, and he did so many of the pictures that you see. Okay. That's on our honeymoon. in the Italian Riviera, which is opposite the French Riviera. And that's in Rome. What is that? I'm standing on a ladder. Whatever. Yeah, this is my first kitchen in Atlanta that I was so proud of. I never had a kitchen of my own. And this is an ID that I had as a refugee. This is George's ID. Which is that? Oh, this is the way to America. This was a transport ship that was given to the refugee organization to bring the people here. And that's and this is our first baby here. This is the rare picture of Atlanta with a huge amount of snow, you remember. This is the picture of the Johnson inauguration. We were invited to the inauguration ball, and we had a wonderful time. That's a real formal family picture. Here's George with his best buddies in Canada. This is my mother. This is George and Louis with the crazy hat. And this is the picture of the paintings that George brought home one year from Italy. And there was a big article about the paintings in the Atlanta Journal. And what is this? Oh, Lynn's wedding. That was a memorable. and we are dancing. This is my dear friend Edith in the backyard of our house, the only house that we had. That's where the children were born and raised. And this is the last picture that was so sad, George in a nursing home. This is my hangout with my lovely friends in Vinings with my partners. This is Judy and Louis. And this is the Goldman family. And this is Luce's two girls, Eva Marie on the back and Katerina here. Okay, who's this? That's Eva, 16-year-old. And that's George in the uniform. That's the uniform that he purchased to escape from the last forced labor camp. And that's me, I think it was 18 or something. George as a young student. That's my secretarial service in Hungary. And I'm standing in the door there. And this is, what is that room? This Milano, yeah. This is the zoo in Rome. That was free there, and we enjoyed it so much. We're sitting in one of the interesting places in Rome. That's Rome. That's the shooting gallery. That's it. Thank you.